Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Hunchback of Notre-Dame by Victor Hugo. We are 9% in, which means we are in Book the First, Part 1, about to start Chapter 5. But first, reading updates. I already returned the book that I'm about to talk about, but I finished The Frugal, let's see if I can remember the title, The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England. There we go, by Brandon Sanderson. I finished it. It was a very quick read, very easy. It is about this guy who wakes up, so it's like the blank slate trope. So he wakes up not knowing who he is, where he is, anything like that, but he wakes up and he is in medieval England. And he knows he's not from medieval England. So he has this handbook that is next to him that has a bunch of ripped out pages. And so he thinks that in order to figure out what is going on, he needs to find these pages. And of course, he's slowly getting his memories. And of course, there's tragedy and things happening in medieval England because medieval England. So it's a romp. It's a good romp. It's not like a super serious thing, even though there are serious things that happen in it. It doesn't have the tone of it being like doom and gloom and upset. It has more of the tone of like sarcastic sassiness, kind of like how Project Hail Mary has that like very serious things, but also let's throw in some jokes type of a deal and some sarcasm. So I finished that and I started reading, I'm going to get the author wrong, so I need to like pull it up. But I started reading or listening to, excuse me, Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and it is translated, but it's really good. I did not get very far. I'm like 20% in. I've listened to about an hour and a half of it. It's an 8-hour audiobook, and it is very well written and very upsetting. Very upsetting. Right now we are following our main character who is a girl, and the way that she is telling the story almost feels like the book A Tale for the Time Being, in that her views are very succinct and stark, and she's just trying to figure out the world that she's growing up in, but also wanting to escape it at the same time. It's very good. I don't, again, know too much about it, but I'm very much enjoying it so far. And of course, I'm reading Robin Hobb. Forever reading Robin Hobb. That one I'm only like 5 chapters into, and it is a long book. The one that I'm reading is Fool's Fate, and it is the third book of the third trilogy, and there's like 900 something pages in it, so it's gonna take me a bit. But we're making our way through. It's fine. But I think that's all I'm reading. All right. Today, though, we are reading The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. Before we get into it, though, let's just remind ourselves that I don't speak French. And I will be upsetting everybody anytime a French word comes up. I will be upsetting people anytime a English word comes up that I cannot say. So why should I even pretend that it's just French? But we're about to start chapter 5 in the first part. And let's see, what has happened? Not very much, but at the same time, so much. So we are outside of this cathedral, and there is this like puppet show going on, but at the same time, while the performers are trying to do their show, all of these like royals are coming out, and so the crowd is very distracted and everything like that, and it is the Feast of Fools, and there is a beggar who we don't know yet, but there is a beggar who's walking around asking for money and interrupts things and gets called out and all of these things. And I think at the very end of what we were reading was, I don't remember names either, so oopsie toodle, we'll get into that. But it was Yeah, so one of the guys who was introduced, who's not like a highfalutin guy, but just like is a guy, and people are like snuffing their noses. That's not what people say, but that's what they're doing. And he's like, I thought this was a party. Like, this is the way that we celebrate the Feast of Fools here. Like, we need to find all of you ugly people and like celebrate how ugly you are and put you on show and whatever. And he's like, what about you? And like points out people. And so that's about where we stopped. And the next chapter is called Quasimodo. So there we go. And I know that the Disney movie is so different because it's a Disney movie, but I'm trying to be like, oh yeah. Oh yeah, that was there. Oh yeah, that was in the movie. Sure. Yeah. Sure. So it's interesting to try and find that out. Book the First, Part 1, Chapter 5. Quasimodo. In the twinkling of an eye, all was ready to execute Caponoli's idea. Bourgeois, scholars, and law clerks all set to work. The little chapel situated opposite the marble table was selected for the scene of the grinning match. A pane broken in the pretty rose window above the door left free a circle of stone through which it was agreed that the competitors should thrust their heads. In order to reach it, it was only necessary to mount upon a couple of hogsheads, which had been produced from I know not where, and perched one upon the other, after a fashion. It was settled that each candidate, man or woman, for it was possible to choose a female pope, should, for the sake of leaving the impression of his grimace flesh fresh and complete, cover his face and remain concealed in the chapel until the moment of his appearance. In less than an instant, the chapel was crowded with competitors, upon whom the door was then closed. Caponoli, from his post, ordered all, directed all, arranged all. During the uproar, the cardinal, no less abashed than Gringoire, had retired with all his suite, under the pretext of business and vespers, without the crowd, which his arrival had so deeply stirred, being in the least moved by his departure. Guillaume Rime was the only one who noticed his eminence's discomfiture. The attention of the populace, like the sun, pursued its revolution. Having set out from one end of the hall, and halted for a space in the middle, it had now reached the other end. The marble table, the brocaded gallery had each had their day. It was now the turn of the chapel of Louis XI. Henceforth, the field was open to all folly. There was no one there now but the Flemings and the rabble. The grimaces began. The first face which appeared at the aperture, with eyelids turned up to the reds, a mouth open like a maw, and a brow wrinkled like our hussar boots of the Empire, evoked such an inextinguishable peal of laughter that Homer would have taken all these louts for gods. Nevertheless, the grand hall was anything but Olympus, and Gringoire's poor Jupiter knew it better than anyone else. A second and third grimace followed, then another, and another, and the laughter and transports of delight went on increasing. There was in this spectacle a peculiar power of intoxication and fascination, of which it would be difficult to convey to the reader of our day and our salons any idea. Let the reader picture to himself a series of visages presenting successfully all geometrical forms, from the triangle to the trapezium, from the cone to the polyhedron, all human expressions, from wrath to lewdness, all ages, from the wrinkles to the newborn babe, to the wrinkles of the aged and dying, all religious phantasmagories, from faun to Beelzebub, all animal profiles, from the maw to the beak, from the jowl to the muzzle. Let the reader imagine all these grotesque figures on the Pont Neuf, those nightmares petrified beneath the hand of Germain Pilon, assuming life and breath, and coming in turn to stare you in the face with burning eyes. All the masks of the Carnival of Venice, passing in succession before your glass. In a word, a human kaleidoscope. The orgy grew more and more Flemish. Teniers could have given but a very perfect idea of it. Let the reader picture to himself in bacchanal form Salvator Rosa's battle. There were no longer either scholars or ambassadors or bourgeois or men or women. There was no longer any Clopin Chauffeau, no Giles Lecornu, nor Marie Quatre Livres, nor Robin Poussepin. All was universal license. The grand hall was no longer anything but a vast furnace of effrontery and joviality, where every mouth was a cry, every individual a posture, everything shouted and howled. The strange visages which came, in turn, to gnash their teeth in the rose window, were like so many brands cast into the brazier, and from the whole of this effervescing crowd there escaped, as from a furnace, a sharp, piercing, stinging noise, hissing like the wings of a gnat. Oh, hey, curse it! Just look at that face! It's not good for anything. Yermet, mon gros pisse, just look at that bull's muzzle. It only lacks the horns. It can't be your husband. Another. Belly of the Pope, what sort of grimace is that? Oh, he is cheating. One must show only one's face. That damned Pierrette, Caillebotte, she's capable of that. Good, good. Oh, I'm stifling. There's a fellow whose ears won't go through, etc., etc. But we must do justice to our friend Jehan. In the midst of this witches' Sabbath, he was still to be seen on the top of his pillar, like the cabin boy on the topmast. He floundered about with incredible fury. His mouth was wide open, and from it there escaped a cry which no one heard. Not that it was covered by the general clamor, just as that was, but because it attained, no doubt, the limit of perceptible sharp sounds, the 1,000 vibrations of savoir, or the 8,000 of Biot. As for Gringoire, the first moment of depression having passed, he had regained his composure. He had hardened himself against adversity. Continue, he had said for the third time to his comedians, speaking machines. Then, as he was marching with great strides in front of the marble table, a fancy seized him to go and appear in his turn at the aperture of the chapel, were it only for the pleasure of making a grimace at that ungrateful populace. But no, that would not be worthy of us. No, vengeance! Let us combat until the end, he repeated to himself. The power of poetry over people is great. I will bring them back. We shall see which will carry the day, grimaces or polite literature. Alas, he had been left the sole spectator of his piece. It was far worse than it had been a little while before. He no longer beheld anything but backs. I am mistaken. The big, patient man, whom he had already consulted in a critical moment, had remained with his face turned towards the stage. As for Gisquet and Leonard, they had deserted him long ago. Gringoire was touched to the heart by the fidelity of his only spectator. He approached him and addressed him, shaking his arm slightly, for the good man was leaning on the balustrade and dozing a little. Monsieur, said Gringoire, I thank you. Monsieur, replied the big man with a yawn. For what? I see what wearies you, resumed the poet. 'Tis all this noise which prevents your hearing comfortably. But be at ease. Your name shall descend to posterity. Your name, if you please? Renaud Chateau, guardian of the seals of the Chalet of Paris, at your service. Monsieur, you are the only representative of the muses here, said Gringoire. You are too kind, sir, said the guardian of the seals at the chalet. You are the only one, resumed Gringoire, who has listened to the piece decorously. What do you think of it? replied the fat magistrate, half aroused. It's tolerably jolly. That's a fact. Gringoire was forced to content himself with this eulogy, for a thunder of applause, mingled with a prodigious acclamation, cut their conversation short. The Pope of the Fools had been elected. Noel! 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 And there is a note right after that, and it says, the ancient French hurrah. I feel like that didn't need a footnote, but that's fine. Noel! Shouted the people on all sides. That was, in fact, a marvelous grimace which was beaming at that moment through the aperture in the rose window. After all the pentagonal, hexagonal, and whimsical faces which had succeeded each other at that hole without realizing the ideal of the grotesque which their imaginations, excited by the orgy, had constructed, nothing less was needed to win their suffrages than the sublime grimace which had just dazzled the assembly. Master Coppenol himself applauded, and Clopin Truffaut, who had been among the competitors, and God knows what intensity of ugliness his visage could attain, confessed himself conquered. We will do the same. We shall not try to give the reader an idea of that tetrahedral nose, that horseshoe mouth, that little left eye obstructed with a red, bushy, bristling eyebrow, while the right eye disappeared entirely beneath an enormous wart, of those teeth in disarray, broken here and there, like the embattled parapet of a fortress, of that callous lip upon which one of these teeth encroached, like the tusk of an elephant, of that forked chin, and above all, of the expression spread over the whole, of that mixture of malice, amazement, and sadness. Let the reader dream of this whole, if he can. The acclamation was unanimous. People rushed towards the chapel. They made the lucky Pope of the Fools come forth in triumph. But it was then that surprise and admiration attained their highest pitch. The grimace was his face. Or rather, his whole person was a grimace. A huge head, bristling with red hair, between his shoulders an enormous hump, a counterpart perceptible in front. A system of thighs and legs so strangely astray that they could touch each other only at the knees, and, viewed from the front, resembled the crescents of two scythes joined by the handles. Large feet, monstrous hands, and, with all this deformity, an indescribable and redoubtable air of vigor, agility, and courage. Strange exception to the eternal rule which wills that force as well as beauty shall be the result of harmony. Such was the Pope whom the fools had just chosen for themselves. One would have pronounced him a giant who had been broken and badly put together again. When this species of Cyclops appeared on the threshold of the chapel, motionless, squat, and almost as broad as he was tall, squared on the base, as a great man says, with his doublet half red, half violet, sewn with silver bells. And, above all, in the perfection of his ugliness, the populace recognized him on the instant, and shouted with one voice, "'Tis Quasimodo, the bell-ringer! 'Tis Quasimodo, the hunchback of Notre-Dame! Quasimodo, the one-eyed! Quasimodo, the bandy-legged! Noel! Noel!" It will be seen that the poor fellow had a choice of surnames. "Let the women with child beware," shouted the scholars. "Or those who wish to be," resumed Johann. The women did, in fact, hide their faces. "Oh, the horrible monkey," said one of them. "As wicked as he is ugly," retorted another. "He's the devil," added a third. "I have the misfortune to live near Notre-Dame. I hear him prowling around the eaves by night. With the cats. He's always on our roofs. He throws spells down our chimneys. The other evening he came and made a grimace at me through my attic window. I thought it was a man. Oh, such a fright as I had. I'm sure that he goes to the witch's sabbath. Once he left a broom on my leads. Oh, what a displeasing hunchback's face. Oh, what an ill-favored soul. Ugh. The men, on the contrary, were delighted and applauded. Quasimodo, the object of the tumult, still stood on the threshold of the chapel, somber and grave, and allowed them to admire him. One scholar, Robin Poissepin, I think, came and laughed in his face, and too close. Quasimodo contented himself with taking him by the girdle and hurling him 10 paces off amid the crowd, all without uttering a word. Master Coppenole, in amazement, approached him. Cross of God! Holy Father, you possess the handsomest ugliness that I have ever known in my life. You would deserve to be Pope at Rome, as well as at Paris. So saying, he placed his hand happily on his shoulder. Quasimodo did not stir. Coppenole went on. You are a rogue with whom I have a fancy for carousing. Were it to cost me a new dozen of 12 livres of Tours. How does it strike you? Quasimodo made no reply. Cross of God, said the hosier, are you deaf? He was, in truth, deaf. Nevertheless, he began to grow impatient with Coppenole's behavior, and suddenly turned towards him with so formidable a gnashing of teeth that the Flemish giant recoiled like a bulldog before a cat. Then there was created around that strange personage a circle of terror and respect, whose radius was at least 15 geometrical feet. An old woman explained to Coppenole that Quasimodo was deaf. Deaf, said the hosier, and his great Flemish laugh. Cross of God, he's a perfect pope. Recognize him, exclaimed Jehan, who had, at last, descended from his capital in order to see Quasimodo at closer quarters. He's the bell-ringer of my brother, the archdeacon. Good day, Quasimodo. What a devil of a man, said Robin Poissepin, still all bruised with his fall. He shows himself. He's a hunchback. He walks. He's bandy-legged. He looks at you. He's one-eyed. You speak to him. He's deaf. And what does this Polyphemus do with his tongue? He speaks when he chooses, said the old woman. He became deaf through ringing the bells. He is not dumb. That he lacks, remarks Jehan. And he has one eye too many, added Robin. Not at all, said Jehan wisely. A one-eyed man is far less complete than a blind man. He knows what he lacks. In the meantime, all the beggars, all the lackeys, all the cut-purses, joined with the scholars, had gone in procession to seek, in the cupboard of the law clerk's company, the cardboard tiara and the derisive robe of the Pope of the Fools. Quasimodo allowed them to array him in them without wincing, and with a sort of proud docility. Then they made him seat himself on a motley litter. 12 officers of the fraternity of fools raised him on their shoulders, and a sort of bitter and disdainful joy lighted up the morose face of the Cyclops, when he beheld beneath his deformed feet all those heads of handsome, straight, well-made man. Then the ragged and howling procession set out on its march according to custom, around the inner galleries of the courts, before making the circuit of the streets and squares. End of chapter 5. All right, chapter 5, we do have officially the introduction of Quasimodo. And before he is unveiled, a bunch of people are lining up trying to make really ugly faces and like doing tricks with their eyeballs and like whatever they're doing with their faces to win the title of being Pope of the Fools. It's like this competition that's going on. And at the same time, while all of this is happening, Gringoire, who has the show, the play, the mystery going on, is still trying so hard to get people to pay attention to him. And it's not working. And there's one person that he has like a little exchange for, and the guy is like, yeah, I mean, it's all right. It's fine. Your show's okay. But then as people are going through, then we come across Quasimodo, and we get a very in-depth description of him, and not a kind description. And people are like, oh my gosh, that's his actual face. And then it's like, oh yeah, he's the bell ringer. I see him all the time. He frightens me. I think he's a witch, and that he goes to the witches' sabbaths and he's thrown spells at me. I hear him looming around with cats in the middle of the night, which, I mean, sorry. But they're like, you are so ugly. Like, speak to us, you know? And they're like, well, he's deaf. He can't hear you. And he's like, oh, well, of course he's deaf. Like, that obviously makes sense. And this older woman who, like, knows more about him is like, yeah, he can talk, but he went deaf because he rings the bells, and ear protection just, like, it's not a real thing. Um, and so they're like, yeah, you're the Pope of Fools. You're the ugliest. Let's dress you up and put you on a parade. So they get out a little tiara, like a little cardboard tiara. They have like a big robe that they put him in, and they like lift him up, and they're like trouncing around with him through the streets. So that's where we are. All right. Chapter 6. Esmeralda. We are delighted to be able to inform the reader that during the whole of this scene, Gringoire and his piece had stood firm. His actors, spurred on by him, had not ceased to spout his comedy, and he had not ceased to listen to it. He had made up his mind about the tumult, and was determined to proceed to the end, not giving up the hope of a return of attention on the part of the public. This gleam of hope acquired fresh life when he saw Quasimodo, Coppenole, and the deafening escort of the Pope of the procession of fools quit the hall amid great uproar. The throng rushed eagerly after them. Good, he said to himself. There go all the mischief-makers. Unfortunately, all the mischief-makers constituted the entire audience. In the twinkling of an eye, the grand hall was empty. To tell the truth, a few spectators still remained, some scattered, others in groups around the pillars, women, old men, and children, who had had enough of the uproar and tumult. Some scholars were still perched astride of the window-sills, engaged in gazing into the place. Well, thought Gringoire, here are still as many as are required to hear the end of my mystery. They are few in number, but it is a choice audience, a lettered audience. An instant later, a symphony which had been intended to produce the greatest effect on the arrival of the Virgin was lacking. Gringoire perceived that his music had been carried off by the procession of the Pope of the Fools. Skip it, said he, stoically. He approached a group of bourgeois who seemed to him to be discussing his piece. This is the fragment of conversation which he caught. You know, Master Cheneteau, the Hôtel de Nevers, which belonged to Monsieur de Nemours? Yes, opposite the Chapelle de Broc. Well, the treasury was just let it to Guillaume Alexandre, historian, for 6 livres, 8 sols, Parisian, a year. How rents are going up! Come, said Gringoire to himself, with a sigh. The others are listening. Comrades, suddenly shouted one of the young scamps from the window, La Esmeralda! La Esmeralda in the place! This word produced a magical effect. Everyone who was left in the hall flew to the windows, climbing the walls in order to see, and repeating, La Esmeralda! La Esmeralda! At the same time, a great sound of applause was heard from without. What's the meaning of this? What's the meaning of this Esmeralda? Said Gringoire, wringing his hands in despair. Oh, good heavens, it seems to be the turn of the windows now. He returned towards the marble table and saw that the representation had been interrupted. It was precisely at the instant when Jupiter should have appeared with his thunder, but Jupiter was standing motionless at the foot of the stage. Michel Gibbon, cried the irritated poet, what are you doing there? Is that your part? Come up. Alas, said Jupiter, a scholar has just seized the ladder. Gringoire looked. It was but too true. All communication between his plot and its solution was intercepted. The rascal, he murmured. And why did he take that ladder? In order to go and see the Esmeralda, replied Jupiter piteously. He said, come, here's a ladder that's of no use, and he took it. This was the last blow. Gringoire received it with resignation. May the devil fly away with you, he said to the comedian, and if I get my pay, you shall receive yours. Then he beat a retreat with drooping head, but the last in the field, like a general who has fought well. And as he descended the winding stairs of the courts, a fine rabble of asses and dolts, these Parisians, he muttered between his teeth. They come to hear a mystery and don't listen to it at all. They are engrossed by everyone, by Clopin, by the Cardinal, by Coppenol, by Quasimodo, by the devil, but by Madame the Virgin Mary, not at all. If I had known, I'd have given you Virgin Mary, you ninnies, and I, to come to see the faces and behold only backs, to be a poet, and to reap the success of an apothecary. It is true that Homerus begged through the Greek towns, and that Nassau died in exile among the Muscovites. But may the devil flay me if I understand what they mean with their Esmeralda. What is that word in the first place? 'Tis Egyptian. End of the chapter, and end of the first book. All right, so the chapter was called Esmeralda, but we didn't actually see Esmeralda. So everybody is following the procession of the Pope of the Fools. So everybody's following Quasimodo out through the streets, and this is when Gringoire is like, ah yes, all of those idiots and nincompoops are leaving, and only the people who are actually interested in art will stay for the rest of this mystery. But like nobody has stayed. There's very, very few people, and the people who have stayed are just because they don't really want to go around with the procession. But then we hear somebody shouting, and then a lot of people shouting about Esmeralda. And Gringoire's like, I don't know what that means. What is an Esmeralda? What are you saying to me? And he's decided that he's going to continue with the show, but then with the Esmeralda interruption, he just is defeated, and he's like, all right, fine. And so he just gets up and leaves. And is just like muttering to himself, like, oh, these silly Parisians that have come to see a play, and then they just leave. Like, how? Oh, I just don't understand them. And what is Esmeralda? What does that mean? And that's where we've ended. All right, so book the second, chapter 1, from Charybdis to Scylla. Night comes on early in January. The streets were already dark when Gringoire issued forth from the courts. This gloom pleased him. He was in haste to reach some obscure and deserted alley, in order there to meditate at his ease, and in order that the philosopher might place the first dressing upon the wound of the poet. Philosophy, moreover, was his sole refuge, for he did not know where he was to lodge for the night. After the brilliant failure of his first theatrical venture, he dared not return to the lodging which he occupied in the Rue Grenier-sur-Lot, opposite to the Porte au Foin, having depended upon receiving from Monsieur the Provost for his epithalamium the wherewithal to pay Master Guillaume Dulsart, farmer, of the taxes on cloven-footed animals in Paris, the rent which he owed him, that is to say, 12 sols Parisian, 12 times the value of all that he possessed in the world, including his trunk hose, his shirt, and his cap. After reflecting a moment, temporarily sheltered beneath the little wicket of the prison of the treasurer of the Sainte-Chapelle, as to the shelter which he would select for the night, having all the pavements of Paris to choose from, he remembered to have noticed the week previously in the Rue de la Savatière, at the door of the Councillor of the Parliament, a stepping-stone for mounting a mule, and to have said to himself that that stone would furnish, on occasion, a very excellent pillow for a mendicant or a poet. He thanked Providence for having sent this happy idea to him, but, as he was preparing to cross the place, in order to reach the tortuous labyrinth of the city, where meander all those old sister streets, the rues de la Barillière, de la Draperie, de la Savaterie, de la Juiverie, etc., still extant today, with their 9-story houses, he saw the procession of the Pope of the Fools, which was also emerging from the courthouse and rushing across the courtyard with great cries, a great flashing of torches, and the music which belonged to him, Gringoire. This sight revived the pain of his self-love. He fled. In the bitterness of his dramatic misadventure, everything which reminded him of the festival of that day irritated his wound and made it bleed. He was on the point of turning to the Pont Saint-Michel. Children were running about here and there with fire lances and rockets. "Pest on firework candles," said Gringoire. And he fell back on the Pont aux Chaines. To the house at the head of the bridge there had been affixed 3 small banners representing the king, the Dauphine, Marguerite of Flanders, and 6 little pennons on which were portrayed the Duke of Austria, the Cardinal de Bourbon, Monsieur de Beaujeu, and Madame Jeanne de France, and Monsieur the Bastard of Bourbon, and I know not whom else, all being illuminated with torches. The rabble were admiring. "Happy painter, Jehan," said Gringoire, with a deep sigh, and he turned his back upon the bannerets and pennons. A street opened before him. He thought it so dark and deserted that he hoped to there escape from all the rumors as well as from all the gleams of the festival. At the end of a few moments his foot came to contact with an obstacle. He stumbled and fell. It was the May truss, which the clerks of the clerks' law court had deposited that morning at the door of a president of the Parliament. In honor of the solemnity of the day, Gringoire bore this new disaster heroically. He picked himself up and reached the water's edge. After leaving behind him the civic Tournelle and the criminal tower, and skirted the great walls of the King's Garden on that unpaved strand where the mud reached to his ankles, he reached the western point of the city, and considered for some time the islet of the Passereau Vache, which has disappeared beneath the bronze horse of the Pont Neuf. The islet appeared to him in the shadow like a black mass, beyond the narrow strip of whitish water which separated him from it. One could divine by the ray of a tiny light the sort of hut in the form of a beehive where the ferrymen of Cowes took refuge at night. "Happy ferrymen," thought Gringoire, "you do not dream of glory, and you do not make marriage songs. What matters it to you if kings and duchesses of Burgundy marry? You know no other daisies than those which your April greensward gives your cows to brown upon, while I, a poet, am hooted and shiver, and owe 12 sous, and the soles of my shoes are so apparent that they might serve as glasses for your lantern. Thanks, ferryman. Your cabin rests my eyes, and makes me forget Paris. He was roused from his almost lyric ecstasy by a big, double Saint Jean cracker, which suddenly went off from the happy cabin. It was the cow ferryman, who was taking his part in the rejoicings of the day and letting off fireworks. This cracker made Gringoire's skin bristle up all over. Ugh, accursed festival, he exclaimed. Wilt thou pursue me everywhere? Ugh, good God, even to the ferryman's. Then he looked at the Seine at his feet, and a horrible temptation took possession of him. Oh, he said, I would gladly drown myself were the water not so cold. Then a desperate resolution occurred to him. It was, since he could not escape from the Pope of the Fools, from Jehan's banneret, from May trusses, from squibs and crackers, to go to the Place de Grève. At least, he said to himself, I shall there have a firebrand of joy wherewith to warm myself, and I can sup on some crumbs of the 3 great armorial bearings of royal sugar which have been erected on the public refreshment stall of the city. End of chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1. Not too much has happened. We're just following Gringoire as he is meandering down the streets, just trying to escape the chaos of the festival. And he's all the way down at the river and the ferryman, and he's like, oh, at last. But then, like, little fireworks go off, and he's upset again because he hates fun, basically. No, he's just still mad that nobody paid attention to his show, and rather it just, snowballed into the Pope of Fools and that sort of pish posh that he is obviously so much higher above. Chapter 2. The Place de Grève. There remains today but a very imperceptible vestige of the Place de Grève, such as it existed then. It consists in the charming little turret which occupies the angle north of the place, and which, already enshrouded in the ignoble plaster which fills with paste the delicate lines of its sculpture, would soon have disappeared, perhaps submerged by that flood of new houses which so rapidly devours all the ancient facades of Paris. The persons who, like ourselves, never cross the Place de Grève without casting a glance of pity and sympathy on that poor turret strangled between 2 hovels of the time of Louis XV, can easily reconstruct in their minds the aggregate of edifices to which it belonged, and find again entire in it the ancient Gothic place of the 15th century. It was then, as it is today, an irregular trapezoid, bordered on one side by the quay, and on the other 3 by a series of lofty, narrow, and gloomy houses. By day, one could admire the variety of its edifices, all sculptured in stone or wood, and already presenting complete specimens of the different domestic architectures of the Middle Ages, running back from the 15th to the 11th century, from the casement which had begun to dethrone the arch to the Roman semicircle, which had been supplanted by the ogive, and which still occupies, below it, the first story of that ancient house de la Tour Roland, at the corner of the place upon the Seine, on the side of the street with the Tannery. At night, one could distinguish nothing of all that mass of buildings except the black indentation of the roofs, unrolling their chain of acute angles round the place, For one of the radical differences between the cities of that time and the cities of the present day lay in the facades which looked upon the places and streets, and which were then gables. For the last 2 centuries, the houses have been turned round. In the center of the eastern side of the place rose a heavy and hybrid construction, formed of 3 buildings placed in juxtaposition. It was called by 3 names which explained its history, its destination, and its architecture. The House of the Dauphin, because Charles V, when Dauphin, had inhabited it. The Merchandise, because it had served as town hall. And the Pillared House. And the Pillared House, there we go, because of a series of large pillars which sustained the 3 stories. The city found there all that is required for a city like Paris: a chapel in which to pray to God, a plaidoyer, or pleading room, in which to hold hearings and to repel, at need, the king's people, and under the roof, an arsenic full of artillery. For the bourgeois of Paris were aware that it is not sufficient to pray in every conjunction, and to plead for the franchises of the city, and they had always in reserve, in the garret of the town hall, a few good rusty arquebuses, the greve, and then that sinister aspect which it preserves today from the execrable ideas which it awakens, and from the sombre town hall of Dominique Bocador, which has replaced the pillared house. It must be admitted that a permanent gibbet and a pillory, a justice and a ladder, as they were called in that day, erected side by side in the center of the pavement, contributed not a little to cause eyes to be turned away from that fatal place where so many beings full of life and health have agonized, where, 50 years later, that fever of Saint Valliere was destined to have its birth. That terror of the scaffold, the most monstrous of all maladies, because it comes not from God, but from man. It is a consoling idea, let us remark in passing, to think that the death penalty, which 300 years ago still encumbered with its iron wheels, its stone gibbets, and all its paraphernalia of torture, permanent and riveted to the pavement, the greve, the halls, the Place Dauphine, the Cross du Trahor, the Marche aux Pourceaux, that hideous Montfaucon, the Barrière des Sergents, the Place aux Chats, the Porte Saint-Denis, Champeaux, the Porte Baudet, the Porte Saint-Jacques, without reckoning the innumerable ladders of the provosts, the bishops of the chapters, of the abbots, of the priors, who had the decree of life and death, without reckoning the judicial drownings in the river. It is consoling today, after having lost successfully all of the pieces of its armor, its luxury of torment, its penalty of imagination and fancy, its torture for which it constructed every 5 years of leather bed at the Grand Châtelet, that ancient suzerain of feudal society, almost expunged from our laws and our cities, hunted from code to code, chased from place to place, has no longer, in our immense Paris, any more than a dishonored corner of the greve, than a miserable guillotine, furtive, uneasy, shameful, which seems always afraid of being caught in the act, so quickly does it disappear after having dealt its blow. End of chapter 2. Okay, this chapter is all about architecture. All about architecture, and specifically about this one place where it's like, oh yeah, the architecture is great and everything, and also this is where they used to kill people 300 years ago when the death penalty was a thing. But just beautiful descriptions of the architecture, and we already knew that was going to happen. This is a love letter to Gothic architecture, which is really cool. But yeah, the proper names I'm struggling with. I'm struggling, and I'm forcing you to struggle with me. Join me in this struggle. It's fine. It's fine. But again, this is something that we have seen with Victor Hugo in The Man Who Laughs, where we get history and scenery and all of the extra context woven into the actual story. And he's like, okay, we have story. Let's look at these buildings. Okay, we have a little bit more story. Okay, now this character is looking at these buildings. It's a great way for setting the scene, setting the tone as well, to be like, ooh, these buildings are awe-inspiring, and while they're also beautiful, they also have like this deep, dark history that needs to be retained and remembered. And I think that's pretty cool. Good job, Victor Hugo. Good job. All right. Chapter 3. Kisses for Blows. When Pierre Gringoire arrived on the Place de Grève, he was paralyzed. He had directed his course across the Pont aux Meuniers in order to avoid the rabble on the Pont aux Chaines and the pennons of Gihon. But the wheels of all the bishop's mills had splashed him as he passed, and his doublet was drenched. It seemed to him, besides, that the failure of his piece had rendered him still more sensible to cold than usual. Hence, he made haste to draw near the bonfire, which was burning magnificently in the middle of the place. But a considerable crowd formed a circle around it. Accursed Parisians, he said to himself, for Gringoire, like a true dramatic poet, was subject to monologues. There they are, obstructing my fire. Nevertheless, I am greatly in need of a chimney corner. My shoes drink in the water, and all those cursed mills wept on me. That devil of a bishop of Paris, with his mills. I'd just like to know what use a bishop can make of a mill. Does he expect to become a miller instead of a bishop, if only my malediction is needed for that? I bestow it upon him, and his cathedral, and his mills. Just see if those boobies will put themselves out. Move aside. I'd like to know what they are doing there. They are warming themselves. Much pleasure may it give them. They are watching 100 torches burn. A fine spectacle. On looking more closely, he perceived that the circle, which was much larger than was required simply for the purpose of getting warm at the king's fire, and that this concourse of people had not been attracted solely by the beauty of the 100 torches which were burning. In a vast space left free between the crowd and the fire, a young girl was dancing. Whether this young girl was a human being, a fairy, or an angel, is what Gringoire, skeptical philosopher and ironical poet that he was, could not decide at the first moment, so fascinated was he by this dazzling vision. She was not tall, though she seemed so boldly did her slender form dart about. She was swarthy in complexion, but one divined that, by day, her skin must possess that beautiful golden tone of the Andalusians and the Roman women. Her little foot, too, was Andalusian, for it was both pinched and at ease in its graceful shoe. She danced, she turned, she twirled rapidly about on an old Persian rug spread negligently under her feet, and each time that her radiant face passed before you, as she whirled, her great black eyes darted a flash of lightning at you. All around you, all around her, all glances were riveted, all mouths open, and, in fact, when she danced thus, to the humming of the Basque tambourine, which her two pure, rounded arms raised above her head, slender, frail, and vivacious as a wasp, and her corsage of gold without a fold, her variegated gown puffing out, her bare shoulders, her delicate limbs, which her petticoat revealed at times, her black hair, her eyes of flame. She was a supernatural creature. In truth, said Gringoire to himself, she is a salamander. She is a nymph. She is a goddess. She is the Bacchante of the Menelaean Mount. At that moment, one of the salamander's braids of hair became unfastened, and a piece of yellow copper which was attached to it rolled to the ground. Oh, she is a traveler. An illusion. All illusions had disappeared. She began her dance once more. She took from the ground 2 swords, whose points she rested against her brow, and which she made to turn in one direction, while she turned in the other. It was purely Romani effect, but, disenchanted though Gringoire was, the whole effect of this picture was not without its charm and its magic. The bonfire illuminated with a red flaring light which trembled, all alive, over the circle of faces in the crowd, on the brow of the young girl, and at the background of the place cast a pallid reflection, on one side upon the ancient black and wrinkled facade of the House of Pillars, on the other upon the old stone gibbet. Among the thousands of visages which that light tinged with scarlet, there was one which seemed, even more than all the others, absorbed in contemplation of the dancer. It was the face of a man, austere, calm, and somber. This man, whose costume was concealed by the crowd which surrounded him, did not appear to be more than 35 years of age. Nevertheless, he was bald. He had merely a few tufts of thin gray hair on his temples. His broad, high forehead had begun to be furrowed with wrinkles, but his deep-set eyes sparkled with extraordinary youthfulness, an ardent life, a profound passion. He kept them fixed incessantly on this woman, and while the giddy young girl of 16 danced and whirled for the pleasure of all, his reverie seemed to become more and more somber. From time to time a smile and a sigh met upon his lips, but the smile was more melancholy than the sigh. The young girl stopped at length, breathless, and the people applauded her, lovingly. "Jolly," said the performer. Then Gringoire saw come up to her a pretty little white goat, alert, wide awake, glossy, with gilded horns, gilded hoofs, and gilded collar, which he had not hitherto perceived, and which had remained lying curled up on one corner of the carpet, watching his mistress dance. "Jolly," said the dancer, "it is your turn." And seated herself, she gracefully presented her tambourine to the goat. "Jolly," she continued, "what month is this?" The goat lifted its forefoot and struck one blow upon the tambourine. It was the first month of the year, in fact. "Jolly," pursued the young girl, turning her tambourine round, "what day of the month is this?" Jolly raised his little gilt hoof and struck 6 blows on the tambourine. "Jolly," pursued the Egyptian, with still another movement of the tambourine, "what hour of the day is it?" Jolly struck 7 blows. At that moment the clock of the pillar tower rang out 7. People were amazed. "This sorcery at the bottom of this," said a sinister voice in the crowd. It was that of the bald man, who never removed his eyes from the performer. She shuddered and turned round, but applause broke forth and drowned the morose explanation. It even effaced it so completely from her mind that she continued to question her goat. "Jolly, what does Master Couchard Grand Remy, captain of the pistoliers of the town, do at the procession of Candlemas?" Jolly reared himself on his hind legs and began to bleat, marching along with so much dainty gravity that the entire circle of spectators burst into a laugh at this parody of the interested devoutness of the captain of pistoliers. "Charlie," resumed the young girl, emboldened by her growing success, "how preaches Master Jacques Carmelot, procurator to the king of the ecclesiastical court?" The goat seated himself on his hind quarters and began to bleat, waving his forefeet in so strange a manner that, with the exception of the bad French and worse Latin, Jacques Camerlot was their complete gesture, accent, and attitude. And the crowd applauded louder than ever. "Sacrilege! Profanation!" resumed the voice of the bald man. Reformer turned round once more. "Ah," said she, "'tis that villainous man." Then, thrusting her under lip out beyond the upper, she made a little pout, which appeared to be familiar to her, executed a pirouette on her heel, and set about collecting in her tambourine the gifts of the multitude. Big blanks, little blanks, targes, and eagle lyres showered into it. All at once she passed in front of Gringoire. Gringoire put his hand so recklessly into his pocket that she halted. "The devil!" said the poet, finding at the bottom of his pocket the reality, that is to say, a void. In the meantime, the pretty girl stood there, gazing at him with her big eyes, and holding out her tambourine to him and waiting. Gringoire broke into a violent perspiration. If he had all Peru in his pocket, he would certainly have given it to the dancer, but Gringoire had not Peru, and moreover, America had not yet been discovered. Happily, an unexpected incident came to his rescue. "Will you take yourself off, you Egyptian grasshopper?" cried a sharp voice, which proceeded from the darkest corner of the place. The young girl turned round in affright. It was no longer the voice of the bald man. It was the voice of a woman, bigoted and malicious. However, this cry, which alarmed the performer, delighted a troop of children who were prowling about there. "It is the recluse of the Tour, Roland," they exclaimed with wild laughter. "It is the sacked nun who is scolding. Hasn't she supped? Let's carry her the remains of the city refreshments." All rushed towards the pillar house. In the meanwhile, Gringoire had taken advantage of the dancer's embarrassment to disappear. The children's shouts had reminded him that he, also, had not supped, so he ran to the public buffet. But the little rascals had better legs than he. When he arrived, they had stripped the table. There remained not so much as a miserable camichon of 5 sous the pound. Nothing remained upon the wall but slender fleur-de-lis, mingled with rose bushes, painted in 1434 by Matthew Bitternet. It was a meagre supper. It is an unpleasant thing to go to bed without supper. It is a still less pleasant thing not to sup and not to know where one is to sleep. That was Gringoire's condition. No supper, no shelter. He saw himself pressed on all sides by necessity, and he found necessity very crabbed. He had long ago discovered the truth, that Jupiter created men during a fit of misanthropy, and that during a wise man's whole life his destiny holds his philosophy in a state of siege. As for himself, he had never seen the blockade so complete. He heard his stomach sounding a parley, and he considered it very much out of place that evil destiny should capture his philosophy by famine. This melancholy reverie was absorbing him more and more, when a song, quaint but full of sweetness, suddenly tore him from it. It was the young performer who was singing. Her voice was like her dancing, like her beauty. It was indefinable and charming, something pure and sonorous, aerial, winged, so to speak. There were continual outbursts, melodies, unexpected cadences, then simple phrases strewn with aerial and hissing notes, then floods of scales which would have put a nightingale to rout, but in which harmony was also present, then soft modulations of octaves which rose and fell, like the bosom of the young singer. Her beautiful face followed, with singular mobility, all the caprices of her song, from the wildest inspiration to the chastest dignity. One would have pronounced her now a mad creature, now a queen. The words which she sang were in a tongue unknown to Gringoire, and which seemed to him to be unknown to herself. So little relation did the expression which she imparted to her song bear to the sense of the words. Thus, these 4 lines in her mouth were madly happy. Okay, they're not in English. But there is a translation, and it says, "A coffer of great richness in a pillar's heart they found. Within it lay new banners, with figures to astound." And an instant afterwards, at the accents which she imparted to this stanza, "Alrebes de caballo, sin poderse menear, con espadas y los cuellos, ballestas de buen echar." Gringoire felt the tears start to his eyes. Nevertheless, her song breathed joy, most of all, and she seemed to sing like a bird from serenity and heedlessness. The performer's song had disturbed Gringoire's reverie as the swan disturbs the water. He listened in a sort of rapture and forgetfulness of everything. It was the first moment in the course of many hours when he did not feel that he suffered. The moment was brief. The same woman's voice which had interrupted the dance interrupted her song. "Will you hold your tongue, you cricket of hell?" it cried, still from the same obscure corner of the place. The poor cricket stopped short. Gringoire covered up his ears. "Oh," he exclaimed, "a cursed saw with missing teeth, which comes to break the lyre." Meanwhile, the other spectators murmured, like himself, "To the devil with the sacked nun," said some of them. And the old invisible killjoy might have had occasion to repent of her aggressions against this performer, had their attention not been diverted at this moment by the procession of the Pope of the Fools, which, after having traversed many streets and squares, debouched on the Place de Grève, with all its torches and all its uproar. This procession, which our readers have seen set out from the Place de Justice, had organized on the way, and had been recruited by all the knaves, idle thieves, and unemployed vagabonds in Paris, so that it presented a very respectable aspect when it arrived at the Grève. First came Egypt. The Duke of Egypt headed it, on horseback, with his counts on foot, holding his bridle and stirrups for him. Behind them, the male and female Egyptians, pell-mell with their little children crying on their shoulders, all, duke, counts, and populace, in rags and tatters. Then came the kingdom of Argot, that is to say, all the thieves of France, arranged accordingly to the order of their dignity, the minor people walking first. Thus defiled by 4s, with the divers insignia on their grades, in that strange faculty, most of them lame, some cripples, others one-armed, shop clerks, pilgrims, boot-blacks, thimble-riggers, street Arabs, beggars, the blear-eyed beggars, thieves, the weakly, vagabonds, merchants, sham soldiers, goldsmiths, past masters of pickpockets, isolated thieves. A catalogue that would weary Homer. In the center of the conclave of the past masters of pickpockets, one had some difficulty in distinguishing the king of Argot and the grand Khosre, so called, crouching in a little cart drawn by 2 big dogs. After the kingdom of the Argotiers came the Empire of Galilee. Guillerme Rousseau, Emperor of the Empire of Galilee, Emperor of the Empire of Galilee, marched majestically in his robe of purple, spotted with wine, preceded by buffoons wrestling and executing military dances, surrounded by his mace-bearers, his pickpockets, and clerks of the Chamber of Accounts. Last of all came the corporation of law clerks, with its maypoles crowned with flowers, its black robes, its music worthy of the orgy, and its large candles of yellow wax. In the center of this crowd, the grand officers of the Brotherhood of Fools bore on their shoulders a litter more loaded down with candles than the reliquary of Saint Genevieve in time of pest. And on this litter shone resplendent with crosier, cope, and mitre, the new Pope of the Fools, the bell-ringer of Notre-Dame, Quasimodo the Hunchback. Each section of this grotesque procession had its own music. The Egyptians made their drums and African tambourines resound. The slang men, not a very musical race, still clung to the goat's horn trumpet and the gothic rebab of the 12th century. The Empire of Galilee was not much more advanced. Among its music one could hardly distinguish some miserable rebec from the infancy of the art, still imprisoned in the Relami. But it was around the Pope of Fools that all the musical riches of the epoch were displayed in a magnificent discord. It was nothing but soprano rebecs, countertenor rebecs, and tenor rebecs, not to reckon the flutes and brass instruments. Alas, our readers will remember that this was Gringoire's orchestra. It is difficult to convey an idea of the degree of proud and blissful expansion to which the sad and hideous visage of Quasimodo had attained during the transit from the Palace of Justice to the Place de Grave. It was the first enjoyment of self-love that he had ever experienced. Down to that day he had known only humiliation, disdain for his condition, disgust for his person. Hence, deaf though he was, he enjoyed, like a veritable pope, the acclamations of that throng which he hated because he felt that he was hated by it. What mattered it that his people consisted of a pack of fools, cripples, thieves, and beggars? It was still a people, and he was its sovereign. And he accepted seriously all this ironical applause, all this derisive respect with which the crowd mingled, it must be admitted, a good deal of very real fear. For the hunchback was robust, for the bandy-legged fellow was agile, for the deaf man was malicious, 3 qualities which temper ridicule. We are far from believing, however, that the new Pope of the Fools understood both the sentiments which he felt and the sentiments which he inspired. The spirit which was lodged in this failure of a body had, necessarily, something incomplete and deaf about it. Thus, what he felt at the moment was to him absolutely vague, indistinct, and confused. Only joy made itself felt. Only pride dominated. Around that somber and unhappy face there hung a radiance. It was, then, not without surprise and alarm, that at the very moment when Quasimodo was passing the pillar house, in that semi-intoxicated state, a man was seen to dart from the crowd, and to tear from his hands with a gesture of anger his crosier of gilded wood, the emblem of his mock popeship. This man, this rash individual, was the man with the bald brow who, a moment earlier, standing with the performers' group, had chilled the poor girl with his words of menace and of hatred. He was dressed in an ecclesiastical costume. At the moment when he stood forth from the crowd, Gringoire, who had not noticed him up to that time, recognized him. "Hold," he said, with an exclamation of astonishment. "'Tis my master from Hermes, Dom Claude Frollo, the archdeacon. What the devil does he want of that old one-eyed fellow? He'll get himself devoured." A cry of terror arose, in fact. The formidable Quasimodo had hurled himself into the litter, or from the litter, and the women turned aside their eyes in order not to see him tear the archdeacon asunder. He made one bound as far as the priest, looked at him, and fell upon his knees. The priest tore off his tiara, broke his crosier, and rent his tinsel cope. Quasimodo remained on his knees, with head bent and hands clasped. Then there was established between them a strange dialogue of signs and gestures, for neither of them spoke. The priest, erect on his feet, irritated, threatening, imperious. Quasimodo, prostrate, humble, suppliant. And nevertheless, it is certain that Quasimodo could have crushed the priest with his thumb. At length, the archdeacon, giving Quasimodo's powerful shoulder a rough shake, made him a sign to rise and follow him. Quasimodo rose. Then the Brotherhood of Fools, their first stupor having passed off, wished to defend their pope, so abruptly dethroned. The Egyptians, the men of slang, and all the fraternity of law clerks gathered howling round the priest. Quasimodo placed himself in front of the priest, set in play the muscles of his athletic fists, and glared upon the assailants with the snarl of an angry tiger. The priest resumed his somber gravity, made a sign to Quasimodo, and retired in silence. Quasimodo walked in front of him, scattering the crowd as he passed. When they had traversed the populace and the place, the crowd of curious and idle were minded to follow them. Quasimodo then constituted himself the rear guard, and followed the archdeacon, walking backwards, squat, surly, monstrous, bristling, gathering up his limbs, licking his boar's tusks, growling like a wild beast, and imparting to the crowd immense vibrations with a look or a gesture. Both were allowed to plunge into a dark and narrow street, where no one dared to venture after them. So thoroughly did the mere chimera of Quasimodo, gnashing his teeth, bar the entrance. "Here's a marvelous thing," said Gringoire. "But where the deuce shall I find some supper?" End of chapter 3. Okay, so chapter 3. We are back with Gringoire, and he is walking about the streets, and he comes across a performer, a woman performer who's about 16 years old, and she is just beautiful, and she is dancing around, and the crowd is just loving it, and there are a couple people in the crowd, some malicious, bigoted people, who can be heard shouting over the crowd, just comments like "go back home," like those types of things, like you are the devil, like just terrible things to say to somebody. And she ignores them for a while and just keeps performing, and then she's like, "Ah, my little goat," and brings out her little goat and asks the little goat questions, and the goat answers by like banging on the little tambourine, like, "Oh, what month it is," and bang, and like, "What day it is it," and stuff like that, and "What time is it," and "How do you, doing like a little impression of somebody," and it's just super cute, this little goat doing all these things, and the same person is like, this is devil work. There's no way that a goat could do this. Like, this is terrible. This is witchcraft, blah, blah, blah. But the crowd is loving it. The rest of the crowd is just super, super loving it and just having a great time. And she's walking around, taking tips, things like that. And there's a woman far away who's older and I guess used to be a nun, but is just like heard above everybody. And the children are like, "Oh, she's old, she doesn't know what she's talking about, blah, blah, blah." But her words do sting a little bit. And so she walks around all of these things, and Gringoire doesn't have any money and realizes, like, "Oh man, I don't have any money. I can't give her anything." And is a little grateful that she got distracted by the comments, because then he like moved away and didn't feel bad for not being able to pay her anything. So then she moves on to singing, and her voice is just as beautiful as her dancing and just as beautiful as she is as a person. And there's still that woman like shouting and yelling, and the kids are like, oh, we have to go get her food. And Gringoire is like, oh yeah, I haven't eaten either. And so he goes to where there's like a public buffet, but the kids already made it there and there's no food for him. And he realizes, oh, okay, cool. I have no money, I have no food, and I have no place to sleep. The trifecta of upset. But while all this is happening, her performance gets interrupted by the procession of the Pope of the Fools, and Quasimodo is actually kind of enjoying it. He is loving the attention. We're not sure if he fully understands that it's sort of like making fun of him and mean-spirited. He just loves that he doesn't have to hide who he is and he can just be part of the crowd and just have all of these people think that he's, so wonderful for this very specific thing. But Claude Frollo is there and he makes some sign. Well, Quasimodo sees him, and so he like gets off from his throne and bows down before, and they're signing back and forth to each other. And from size, it doesn't look like Claude should have any sort of power over him because he's so much smaller than Quasimodo is. But Quasimodo is very much subservient, and um, Frollo just like rips his crown and like takes off all of his grandeur and motions for him to follow. And so he, gets up and he leaves. What an introduction to the dynamic between these two characters, and then also the dynamic between our performer, who I'm guessing is going to be Esmeralda, um, and society. It's it's a very, very good introduction to all of these things and the interminglings between the relationships of the characters, I think is done very well. All right. Chapter 4. The inconveniences of following a pretty woman through the streets in the evening. What a title. Gringoire set out to follow the performer at all hazards. He had seen her, accompanied by her goat, take to the Rue de la Courtilière. He took the Rue de la Courtilière. Why not? He said to himself. Gringoire, a practical philosopher of the streets of Paris, had noticed that nothing is more propitious to reverie than following a pretty woman without knowing whither she is going. There was in his voluntary abdication of his free will, in this fancy submitting itself to another fancy, which suspects it not, a mixture of fantastic independence and blind obedience, something indescribable, intermediate between slavery and liberty, which pleased Gringoire. A spirit essentially compound, undecided, and complex, holding the extremities of all extremes, incessantly suspended between all human propensities, and neutralizing one by the other. He was fond of comparing himself to Mahomet's coffin, attracted in two different directions by two lodestones, and hesitating eternally between the heights and the depths, between the vault and the pavement, between fall and descent, between zenith and nadir. If Gringoire had lived in our day, what a fine middle course he would hold between classicism and romanticism. But he was not sufficiently primitive to live 300 years, and 'tis a pity. His absence is a void which is but too sensibly felt today. Moreover, for the purpose of thus following passers-by, and especially female passers-by, in the streets, which Gringoire was fond of doing, there is no better disposition than ignorance of where one is going to sleep. So he walked along, very thoughtfully, behind the young girl, who hastened her pace and made her goat trot as she saw the bourgeois returning home and the taverns, the old shops which had been open that day closing. After all, he thought to himself, she must lodge somewhere. Performers have kindly hearts. Who knows? And in the points of suspense which he placed after this reticence in his mind, there lay I know not what flattering ideas. And in the points of suspense which he placed after this reticence in his mind, there lay I know not what flattering ideas. Meanwhile, from time to time, as he passed the last groups of bourgeois, closing their doors, he caught some scraps of their conversation, which broke the thread of his pleasant hypothesis. Now it was two old men accosting each other. "Do you know that it is cold, Master Thibaut Fernacle?" Gringoire had been aware of this since the beginning of winter. "Yes, indeed, Master Boniface Dismore. Disommet. Are we going to have a winter such as we had 3 years ago in '80, when wood cost 8 sous the measure? That's nothing, Master Thibaut, compared to the winter of 1407, when it froze from St. Martin's Day until Candlemas, and so cold that the pen of the registrar of the Parliament froze every 3 words in the Grand Chamber, which interrupted the registration of justice." Further on, there were 2 female neighbors at their windows, holding candles, which the fog caused to sputter. "Has your husband told you about the mishap, mademoiselle?" "No. What is it, mademoiselle the comte?" "The horse of Monsieur Giles Godin, the notary of the Châtelet, took fright at the Flemings and their procession, and overturned Master Philippe Averlot, lay monk of the Celestines." "Really? Actually? A bourgeois horse? 'Tis rather too much. If it had been a cavalry horse, well and good." The windows were closed, but Gringoire had lost the thread of his ideas, nevertheless. And the windows were closed, but Gringoire had lost the thread of his ideas, nevertheless. Fortunately, he speedily found it again, and he knotted it together without difficulty, thanks to this dancer, thanks to Jolly, who still walked in front of him, 2 fine, delicate, and charming creatures, whose tiny feet, beautiful forms, and graceful manners he was engaged in admiring, almost confusing them in his contemplation, believing them to be both young girls, from their intelligence and good friendship, regarding them both as goats, so far as the lightness, agility, and dexterity of their walk were concerned. But the streets were becoming blacker and more deserted every moment. The curfew had sounded long ago, and it was only at rare intervals now that they encountered a passer-by in the street, or a light in the windows. Gringoire had become involved in his pursuit of this dancer, in that inextricable labyrinth of alleys, squares, and closed courts which surround the ancient sepulchre of the Saint Innocents, and which resembles a ball of thread tangled by a cat. "Here are streets which possess but little logic," said Gringoire, lost in the thousands of circuits which returned upon themselves incessantly, but where the young girl pursued a road which seemed familiar to her, without hesitation, and without a step which became ever more rapid. As for him, he would have been utterly ignorant of his situation had he not espied, in passing at the turn of a street, the octagonal mass of the pillory of the fish markets. The open-work summit for which threw its black fretted outlines clearly upon a window which was still lighted in the Rue Verdelet. The girl's attention had been attracted to him for the last few moments. She had repeatedly turned her head towards him with uneasiness. She had even once come to a standstill, and, taking advantage of a ray of light which escaped from a half-open bakery, to survey him intently, from head to foot. Then, having cast this glance, Gringoire had seen her make that little pout which he had already noticed, after which she passed on. This little pout had furnished Gringoire with food for thought. There was certainly both disdain and mockery in that graceful grimace. So he dropped his head, began to count the paving stones, and to follow the young girl at a little greater distance, when, at the turn of a street which had caused him to lose sight of her, he heard her utter a piercing cry. He hastened his steps. The street was full of shadows. Nevertheless, a twist of tow soaked in oil, which burned in a cage at the feet of the Holy Virgin at the street corner, permitted Gringoire to make out the performer struggling in the arms of two men, who were endeavoring to stifle her cries. The poor little goat, in great alarm, lowered his horn and bleated. "Help! Gentlemen of the watch!" shouted Gringoire, and advanced bravely. One of the men who held the young girl turned towards him. It was the formidable visage of Quasimodo. Gringoire did not take to flight, but neither did he advance another step. Quasimodo came up to him, tossed him 4 paces away on the pavement with a backward turn of the hand, and plunged rapidly into the gloom, bearing the young girl folded across one arm like a silken scarf. His companion followed him, and the poor goat ran after them all, bleating plaintively. "Murder! Murder!" shrieked the unhappy girl. "Halt, rascals, and yield me that wench!" Suddenly shouted in a voice of thunder a cavalier who appeared suddenly from a neighboring square. It was a captain of the king's archers, armed from head to foot, with his sword in his hand. He tore the young girl from the arms of the dazed Quasimodo, threw her across his saddle, and at the moment when the terrible hunchback, recovering from his surprise, rushed upon him to regain his prey, 15 or 16 archers, who followed their captain closely, made their appearance with their 2-edged swords in their fists. It was a squad of the king's police, which was making the rounds by order of Monsieur Robert d'Estove, guard of the provostship of Paris. Quasimodo was surrounded, seized, garroted. He roared, he foamed at the mouth, he bit, and had it been broad daylight, there is no doubt that his face alone, rendered more hideous by wrath, would have put the entire squad to flight. But by night he was deprived of his most formidable weapon, his ugliness. His companion had disappeared during the struggle. The young girl gracefully raised herself upright upon the officer's saddle, placed both hands upon the young man's shoulders, and gazed fixedly at him for several seconds, as though enchanted with his good looks and with the aid which he had just rendered her. Then, breaking silence first, she said to him, marking her sweet voice, still sweeter than usual, "What is your name, Monsieur le gendarme?" "Captain Phoebus de Chateaupeau, at your service, my beauty," replied the officer, drawing himself up. "Thanks," said she. And while Captain Phoebus was turning up his mustache in Burgundian fashion, she slipped from the horse, like an arrow falling to earth, and fled. A flash of lightning would have vanished less quickly. "Nombril of the Pope," said the captain, causing Quasimodo's straps to be drawn tighter. "I should have preferred to keep the wench." "What would you have, captain?" said one of the guards. "The warbler has fled, and the bat remains." End of chapter 4. Okay, chapter 4. Gringoire is being a bit weird. He's like, you know what? I don't have any place to sleep, so I'm gonna follow this young 16-year-old performer into the night. And he does. And he kind of gets lost because the streets are so windy. And he's hearing snippets of conversation, just like little bits of gossip, but not enough to really be able to put anything together because, people are inside and the windows are closing and things like that because it's time to go to bed. And when there's a moment when she like looks back and just like pouts and is almost like a little threat or a mock. He's not quite sure, but he steps back just a little bit and doesn't follow quite so closely. And then she turns a corner and he couldn't find her. But then he hears a piercing scream. And so he follows that scream and she is being attacked. And it looks like by two people, and one of them is trying to like cover her mouth to like make the screams stop. And he's standing there and he yells for the guards to come and help. And he doesn't help, but he doesn't run away. And in all of this, Quasimodo is there, and Quasimodo grabs the girl and just like throws her over his shoulder to like get her away from them. And in while that's happening, the king's guard comes and they see that what looks to be Quasimodo stealing this young girl away, and so they stop him and well, they kind of stop him. They try to stop him, and Quasimodo is just like flailing and just, being aggressive because he's trying to protect her. And she's now safe, and the main guard introduces himself, Phoebus, which we know him. If you've seen the movies, we know him. And she's like, "Oh, thank you. What's your name?" And yeah, that's where we are. That's where we are. So we had all of that happen in chapter 4, and then chapter 5 is called Result of the Dangers. Bum, bum, bum. Okay. Here we go. Gringoire, thoroughly stunned by his fall, remained on the pavement in front of the Holy Virgin at the street corner. Little by little he regained his senses. At first, for several minutes, he was floating in a sort of half somnolent reverie, which was not without its charm, in which aerial figures of the woman and her goat were coupled with Quasimodo's heavy fist. This state lasted but a short time. A decidedly vivid sensation of cold in the part of his body which was in contact with the pavement suddenly aroused him and caused his spirit to return to the surface. "Whence comes this chill?" he said abruptly to himself. He then perceived that he was lying half in the middle of the gutter. "That devil of a hunchbacked Cyclops," he muttered between his teeth, and he tried to rise, but he was too much dazed and bruised. He was forced to remain where he was. Moreover, his hand was tolerably free. He stopped up his nose and resigned himself. "The mud of Paris," he said to himself, for decidedly he thought that he was sure that the gutter would prove his refuge for the night, and what can one do in a refuge except dream? The mud of Paris is particularly stinky. It must contain a great deal of volatile and nitric salts. That, moreover, is the opinion of Master Nicholas Flamel, and the alchemists. The word alchemists suddenly suggested to his mind the idea of Archdeacon Claude Frollo. He recalled the violent scene which he had just witnessed in part, and the young girl was struggling with two men, that Quasimodo had a companion, and the morose and haughty face of the Archdeacon passed confusedly through his memory. That would be strange, he said to himself, and on that fact, and that basis, he began to construct a fantastic edifice of hypothesis, that card castle of philosophers. Then, suddenly returning once more to reality, "Come, I'm freezing!" The place was, in fact, becoming less and less tolerable. Each molecule of the gutter bore away a molecule of heat radiating from Gringoire's loins, and the equilibrium between the temperature of his body and the temperature of the brook began to be established in rough fashion. Quite a different annoyance suddenly assailed him. A group of children, those little barefooted savages who have always roamed the pavements of Paris under the eternal name of gamins, and who, when we were also children ourselves, threw stones at all of us in the afternoon when we came out of school, because our trousers were not torn. A swarm of these young scamps rushed toward the square where Gringoire lay, with shouts and laughter, which seemed to pay but little heed to the sleep of the neighbors. They were dragging after them some sort of hideous sack, and the noise of their wooden shoes alone would have roused the dead. Gringoire, who was not quite dead yet, half raised himself. They shouted in deafening tones, "Oh, Eustace Maubon, the merchant at the corner has just died. We've got his straw pallet. We're going to have a bonfire out of it. It's the turn of the Flemish today." And behold, they flung the pallet directly upon Gringoire, beside whom they had arrived without espying him. At the same time, one of them took a handful of straw and set off to light it at the wick of the good Virgin. "'Sdeath," growled Gringoire, "am I going to be too warm now?" It was a critical moment. He was caught between fire and water. He made a superhuman effort, the effort of a counterfeiter of money who is on the point of being boiled and who seeks to escape. He rose to his feet, flung aside the straw pallet upon the street urchins, and fled. "Holy Virgin!" shrieked the children. "'Tis the merchant's ghost!" And they fled in their turn. The straw mattress remained master of the field. Belforet, Father Lejeuse, and Croisette affirm that it was picked up on the morrow with great pomp by the clergy of the quarter, and borne to the treasury of the church of Saint Opportune, where the sacristan, even as late as 1789, earned a tolerably handsome revenue out of the great miracle of the statue of the Virgin at the corner of the Rue Mauconseil, which had, by its mere presence, on the memorable night between the 6th and 7th of January, 1482, exorcised the defunct Eustace Maubon, who, in order to play a trick on the devil, had at his death maliciously concealed his soul in his straw pallet. End of chapter 5. Okay, chapter 5. We have Gringoire, who wakes up in a gutter, and he's confused, and he's having not quite a fever dream, but almost like a fever dream of what has just happened, and he's trying to remember what is going on. And he hears all of these children, these street urchin, if you will, who are just shouting about how somebody is dead, and they're gonna light this pallet on fire. And so they light the pallet on fire, and Gringoire is like, "I am under the pallet." So he bursts out of the pallet, and the children are terrified, and they're like, "Oh my god, it's the ghost of this merchant." And he just leaves. He's like, "Well, I guess I'm gonna not stay here." And he leaves. And so now there's this rumor that this particular merchant has died. I think that's what happened. Maybe that's what happened. All right. We will do one more chapter. It's a doozy, though. It's a long one. So prepare yourselves. Write home to the family. All right. Chapter 6. The Broken Jug. After having run for some time at the top of his speed, without knowing whither, knocking his head against many a street corner, leaping many a gutter, traversing many an alley, many a court, many a square, seeking flight and passage through all the meanderings of the ancient passages of the halls, exploring in his panic terror what the fine Latin of the maps call tota via caminum et viaria, our poet suddenly halted for lack of breath in the first place, and in the second, because he had been collared, after a fashion, by a dilemma which had just occurred to his mind. "It strikes me, Master Pierre Gringoire," he said to himself, placing his finger to his brow, "that you are running like a madman. The little scamps are no less afraid of you than you are of them. It strikes me, I say, that you heard the clatter of their wooden shoes fleeing southward while you were fleeing northward. Now, one or two things. Either they have taken flight, and the pallet which they must have forgotten in their terror is precisely that hospitable bed in search of which you have been running ever since morning, and which Madame the Virgin miraculously sends you, in order to recompense you for having made a morality in your honor, accompanied by triumphs and mummeries. Or the children have not taken flight, and in that case they have put the brand to the pallet, and that is precisely the good fire in which you need to cheer, dry, and warm you. In either case, good fire or good bed, that straw pallet is a gift from heaven. The Blessed Virgin Marie, who stands at the corner of the Rue Malconcel, could only have made Eustace Maubon die for that express purpose, and it is folly on your part to flee thus zigzag, like a Picard before the Frenchman, leaving behind you what you seek before you, and you are a fool. Then he retraced his steps, and feeling his way and searching with his nose to the wind and his ears on the alert, he tried to find the blessed pallet again, but in vain. There was nothing to be found but intersections of houses, closed courts, and crossings of streets, in the midst of which he hesitated and doubted incessantly, being more perplexed and entangled in this medley of streets than he would have been even in the labyrinth of the Hôtel de Tournai. At length he lost patience, and exclaimed solemnly, "Cursed be crossroads! 'Tis the devil who has made them in the shape of his pitchfork." This exclamation afforded him a little solace, and a sort of reddish reflection which he caught sight of at that moment, at the extremity of a long and narrow lane, completed the elevation of his moral tone. "God be praised," said he. "There it is yonder. There is my pallet burning." And comparing himself to the pilot who suffers shipwreck by night, "Salve," he added piously, "salve maris stella." Did he address this fragment of litany to the Holy Virgin or to the pallet? We are utterly unable to say. He had taken but a few steps in the long street, which sloped downwards, was unpaved, and more muddy and steep, when he noticed a very singular thing. It was not deserted. Here and there along its extent crawled certain vague and formless masses, all directing their course towards the light which flickered at the end of the street, like those heavy insects which drag along by night from blade to blade of grass toward the shepherd's fire. Nothing renders one so adventurous as not being able to feel the place where one's pocket is situated. Gringoire continued to advance, and had soon joined that one of the forms which dragged along most indolently behind the others. On drawing near, he perceived that it was nothing else than a wretched legless cripple in a bowl, who was hopping along on his two hands like a wounded field spider, which has but just two legs left. At the moment when he passed close to this species of spider with a human countenance, it raised towards him a lamentable voice. "La bona mansia, signor, la bona mansia," and then the footnote says, "alms." "Deuce take you," said Gringoire, "and me with you, if I know what you mean." And he passed on. He overtook another of these itinerant masses, and examined it. It was an impotent man, both halt and crippled to such a degree that the complicated system of crutches and wooden legs which sustained him gave him the air of a mason's scaffolding on the march. Gringoire, who liked noble and classical comparisons, compared him in thought to the living tripod of Vulcan. This living tripod saluted him as he passed, but stopping his hat on a level with Gringoire's chin, like a shaving dish, while he shouted in the latter's ears, "Señor caballero, para comprar un pedazo de pan." There is a footnote, a translation that says, "Give me the means to buy a bit of bread, sir." "It appears," said Gringoire, "that this one can also talk. but 'tis a rude language, and he is more fortunate than I, if he understands it. Then, smiting his brow in a sudden transition of ideas, by the way, what the deuce did they mean this morning with their Esmeralda? He was minded to augment his pace, but for the third time something barred his way. This something, or rather, someone, was a blind man, a little blind fellow with a bearded, Jewish face, who, rowing away in the space about him with a stick and towed by a large dog, droned through his nose with a Hungarian accent, Facitote caritatum. Well now, said Gringoire, here's one at last who speaks a Christian tongue. I must have a very charitable aspect, since they ask alms of me in the present lean condition of my purse. My friend, and he turned towards the blind man, I sold my last shirt last week. That is to say, since you understand only the language of Cicero, vendidi hebdomadae nuper transita miam ultimum chemisam. That said, he turned his back upon the blind man and pursued his way. But the blind man began to increase his stride at the same time, and behold, the cripple and the legless man, in his bowl, came up on their side in great haste, and with great clamour of bowl and crutches upon the pavement. Then all three, jostling each other at poor Gringoire's heels, began to sing their song to him. Caritatum, chanted the blind man. La bona mansia, chanted the cripple in the bowl. And the lame man took up the musical phrase by repeating, un pedazo de pan. Gringoire stopped by his ears. Oh, Tower of Babel, he exclaimed. He set out to run. The blind man ran. The lame man ran. The cripple in the bowl ran. And then, in proportion as he plunged deeper into the streets, cripples and bowls, blind men and lame men, swarmed about him, and men with one arm and with one eye, and the leprous with their sores, some emerging from little streets adjacent, some from the air-holes of cellars, howling, bellowing, yelping, all limping and halting, all flinging themselves towards the light and humped up in the mire like snails after a shower. Gringoire, still followed by his three persecutors, and not knowing very well what was to become of him, marched along in terror among them, turning out for the lame, stepping over the cripples and bowls, and his feet embedded in that ant-hill of lame men, like the English captain who got caught in the quicksand of a swarm of crabs. The idea occurred to him of making an effort to retrace his steps, but it was too late. This whole legion had closed in behind him, and his three beggars held him fast. So he proceeded, impelled both by this irresistible flood, by fear, and by a vertigo which converted all this into a sort of horrible dream. At last he reached the end of the street. It opened upon an immense place, where 1,000 scattered lights flickered in the confused mists of night. Gringoire flew thither, hoping to escape, by the swiftness of his legs, from the three infirm spectres who had clutched him. Onde vas, hombre? Where are you going, my man? Cried the cripple, flinging away his crutches, and running after him with the best legs that ever traced a geometrical step upon the pavements of Paris. In the meantime, the legless man, erect upon his feet, crowned Gringoire with his heavy iron bowl, and the blind man glared in his face with flaming eyes. Where am I? Cried the terrified poet. In the court of miracles, replied a fourth spectre, who had accosted them. Upon my soul, resumed Gringoire, I certainly do behold the blind who see, and the lame who walk, but where is the Saviour? They replied by a burst of sinister laughter. The poor poet cast his eyes about him. It was, in truth, the redoubtable Cour des Miracles, whither an honest man had never penetrated at such an hour, the magic circle where the officers of the Châtelet and the sergeants of the provostship who ventured thither disappeared in morsels, a city of thieves, a hideous wart on the face of Paris, a sewer, from which escaped every morning and whither returned every night to crouch that stream of vices, of mendicancy, and vagabondage, which always overflows in the streets of capitals, a monstrous hive to which returned at nightfall with their booty all the drones of the social order, a lying hospital where the bohemian, the disfrocked monk, the ruined scholar, the ne'er-do-wells of all nations, Spaniards, Italians, Germans, of all religions, Jews, Christians, Mahometans, idolaters, covered with painted sores, beggars by day, who transformed by night into brigands, an immense dressing room, in a word, where, at that epoch, the actors of that eternal comedy which theft, prostitution, and murder play upon the pavements of Paris, dressed and undressed. It was a vast place, irregular and badly paved, like all the squares of Paris at that date. Fires, around which swarmed strange groups, blazed here and there. Everyone was going, coming, and shouting. Shrill laughter was to be heard, the wailing of children, the voices of women, the hands and heads of this throng, black against the luminous background, outlined against it 1,000 eccentric gestures. At times, upon the ground where trembled the light of the fires, mingled with large, indefinite shadows, one could behold a dog passing, which resembled a man who resembled a dog. The limits of races and species seemed effaced in this city as in a pandemonium. Men, women, beasts, age, sex, health, maladies, all seemed to be in common among these people. All went together. They mingled, confounded, superposed. Each one there participated in all. The poor and flickering flames of the fire permitted Gringoire to distinguish, amid his trouble, all around the immense place, a hideous frame of ancient houses, whose worm-eaten, shriveled, stunted facades, each pierced with one or two lighted attic windows, seemed to him, in the darkness, like enormous heads of old women, ranged in a circle, monstrous and crabbed, winking as they looked on at the witches' Sabbath. It was like a new world, unknown, unheard of, misshapen, creeping, swarming, fantastic. Gringoire, more and more terrified, clutched by the three beggars as by three pairs of tongs, dazed by a throng of other faces which frothed and yelped around him. Unhappy Gringoire endeavored to summon his presence of mind in order to recall whether it was a Saturday. But his efforts were vain. The thread of his memory and of his thoughts was broken, and, doubting everything, wavering between what he saw and what he felt, he put to himself this unanswerable question: if I exist, does this exist? If this exists, do I exist? At that moment, a distant cry arose in the buzzing throng which surrounded him. "Take him to the king! Take him to the king!" "Holy Virgin," murmured Gringoire, "the king must be a ram." "To the king! To the king!" repeated all the voices. They dragged him off. Each vied with the other in laying his claws upon him, but the three beggars did not lose their hold and tore him from the rest, howling, "He belongs to us." The poet's already sickly doublet yielded its last sigh in this struggle. While traversing the horrible place, his vertigo vanished. After taking a few steps, the sentiment of reality returned to him. He began to become accustomed to the atmosphere of the place. At the first moment there had arisen from his poet's head, or simply and prosaically from his empty stomach, a mist, a vapor, so to speak, which, spreading between objects and himself, permitted him to catch a glimpse of them only in the incoherent fog of nightmare, in those shadows of dreams which distort every outline, agglomerating objects into unwieldy groups, dilating things into chimeras and men into phantoms. Little by little, this hallucination was succeeded by a less bewildered and exaggerating view. Reality made its way to the light around him, struck his eyes, struck his feet, and demolished, bit by bit, all that frightful poetry with which he had at first believed himself to be surrounded. He was forced to perceive that he was not walking in the sticks, but in mud, and he was elbowed not by demons, but by thieves. That it was not his soul which was in question, but his life, since he lacked that precious conciliator which places itself so effectually between the bandit and the honest man, a purse. In short, on examining the orgy more closely and with more coolness, he fell from the witch's Sabbath to the dram shop. The Cour des Miracles was, in fact, merely a dram shop, but a brigand's dram shop, reddened quite as much with blood as with wine. The spectacle which presented itself to his eyes when his ragged escort finally deposited him at the end of his trip was not fitted to bear him back to poetry, even to the poetry of hell. It was more than ever the prosaic and brutal reality of the tavern. Were we not in the 15th century, we would say that Gringoire had descended from Michelangelo to Callot. Around a great fire which burned on a large circular flagstone, the flames of which had heated red-hot the legs of a tripod, which was empty for the moment, some worm-eaten tables were placed here and there haphazard, no lackey of a geometrical turn having deigned to adjust their parallelism, or to see to it that they did not make two unusual angles. Upon these tables gleamed several dripping pots of wine and beer, and round these pots were grouped many Bacchic visages, purple with the fire and the wine. There was a man with a huge belly and a jovial face, noisily kissing a woman of the town, thick-set and brawny. There was a sort of sham soldier who was whistling as he undid the bandages of his fictitious wound and removing the numbness from his sound and vigorous knee, which had been swathed since morning in 1,000 ligatures. On the other hand, there was a wretched fellow preparing with celandine and beef's blood his leg of God for the next day. 2 tables further on, a palmer, with his pilgrim's costume complete, was practicing the lament of the Holy Queen, not forgetting the drone and the nasal drawl. Further on, a young scamp was taking a lesson in epilepsy from an old pretender, who was instructing him in the art of foaming at the mouth, by chewing a morsel of soap. Beside him, a man with the dropsy was getting rid of his swelling and making 4 or 5 female thieves who were disputing at the same table over a child who had been stolen that evening hold their noses. All circumstances which, 2 centuries later, seemed so ridiculous to the court, as Sauval says, that they served as a pastime to the king, and as an introduction to the royal ballet of night, divided into 4 parts and danced on the theatre of Petit Bourbon. Never, as an eyewitness of 1653, have the sudden metamorphoses of the Court of Miracles been more happily presented. Benserade prepared us for it by some very gallant verses. Loud laughter everywhere, and obscene songs. Each one held his own course, carping and swearing, without listening to his neighbor. Pots clinked, and quarrels sprang up at the shock of the pots, and the broken pots made rents in the rags. A big dog, seated on his tail, gazed at the fire. Some children were mingled in this orgy. The stolen child wept and cried. Another, a big boy 4 years of age, seated with legs dangling upon a bench that was too high for him, before a table that reached to his chin, and uttering not a word. A third, gravely spreading out upon the table with his finger the melted tallow which dripped from a candle. Last of all, a little fellow crouching in the mud, almost lost in a cauldron which he was scraping with a tile, and from which he was evoking a sound that would have made Stradivarius swoon. Near the fire was a hogshead, and on the hogshead a beggar. This was the king of the throne. The three who had Gringoire in their clutches led him in front of this hogshead, and the entire bacchanal rout fell silent for a moment, with the exception of the cauldron inhabited by the child. Gringoire dared neither breathe nor raise his eyes. "Hombre, quita tu sombrero," said one of the three knaves, in whose grasp he was, and, before he had comprehended the meaning, the other had snatched his hat, a wretched headgear, it is true, but still good on a sunny day or when there was but little rain. Gringoire sighed. Meanwhile the king addressed him from the summit of his casque. "Who is this rogue?" Gringoire shuddered. That voice, although accentuated by menace, recalled to him another voice which that very morning had dealt the death blow to his mystery, by drawling nasally in the midst of the audience. "Charity, please." He held his head. It was, indeed, Clopin Tropheo, arrayed in his royal insignia, wore neither one rag nor more, nor one rag less. The sore upon his arm had already disappeared. He held in his hand one of those whips made of thongs of white leather, which police sergeants then used to repress the crowd, and which they were called bouillets. On his head he wore a sort of headgear, bound round and closed at the top, but it was difficult to make out whether it was a child's cap or a king's crown. The two things bore so strong a resemblance to each other. Meanwhile, Gringoire, without knowing why, had regained some hope, on recognizing in the king of the Cour des Miracles his accursed mendicant of the great hall. "Master," stammered he, "Monseigneur, sire, how ought I to address you?" he said at length, having reached the culminating point of his crescendo, and knowing neither how to mount higher nor to descend again. "Monseigneur, his majesty, or comrade, call me what you please, but make haste. What have you to say in your own defense?" "In your own defense?" thought Gringoire. "That displeases me." He resumed, stuttering, "I am he who, this morning—" "By the devil's claws," interrupted Clopin, "your name, knave, and nothing more. Listen, you are in the presence of three powerful sovereigns: myself, Clopin, king of Thunes, successor of the Grand Corsair, supreme suzerain of the realm of Argot, Matthias Honyadi Spicali, Duke of Egypt and of Bohemia, the old fellow who you see yonder, with a dish clout round his head, Guillaume Rousseau, Emperor of Galilee, that fat fellow who is not listening to us but caressing a wench. We are your judges. You have entered the kingdom of Argot without being an Argotier. You have violated the privileges of our city. You must be punished unless you are a capon, a franc-mateur, or a rifaudet, that is to say, in the slang of honest folks, a thief, a beggar, or a vagabond. Are you anything of that sort? Justify yourself. Announce your titles." "Alas," said Gringoire, "I have not that honor. I am the author—" "That is sufficient," resumed he, without permitting him to finish. "You are going to be hanged. 'Tis a very simple matter, gentlemen and honest bourgeois. As you treat our people in your abode, so we treat you in ours. The law which you apply to vagabonds apply to you. 'Tis your fault if it is harsh. One really must behold the grimace of an honest man above the hempen collar now and then. That renders the thing honorable. Come, friend, divide your rags happily among these damsels. I am going to have you hanged to amuse the vagabonds, and you are to give them your purse to drink your health. If you have any mummery to go through with, there's a very good God the Father in that mortar yonder. in stone, which we stole from Saint Pierre au Boeuf. You have 4 minutes in which to fling your soul at his head. The harangue was formidable. Well said, upon my soul. Clopin preaches like the holy Fowler, the Pope, cried the Emperor of Galilee, smashing his pot in order to prop up his table. Messeigneurs, emperors, and kings, said Gringoire coolly, for I know not how firmness had returned to him, and he spoke with resolution. Don't think of such a thing. My name is Pierre Gringoire. I am the poet whose morality was presented this morning in the grand halls of the courts. Ah, so it was you, master, said Clopin. I was there, par la tête Dieu. Well, comrade, is that any reason, because you bored us to death this morning, that you should not be hung this evening? I shall find difficulty in getting out of it, said Gringoire to himself. Nevertheless, he made one more effort. I don't see why poets are not classed with vagabonds, said he. Vagabond, Aesopus certainly was. Homerus was a beggar. Mercurius was a thief. Clopin interrupted him. I believe that you are trying to blarney us with your jargon. Zounds, let yourself be hung, and don't kick up such a row over it. Pardon me, Monseigneur, the King of Tunis, replied Gringoire, disputing the ground foot by foot. It is worth trouble. One moment. Listen to me. You are not going to condemn me without having heard me. His unlucky voice was, in fact, drowned in the uproar which rose around him. The little boy scraped away at his cauldron with more spirit than ever, and, to crown all, an old woman had just placed on the tripod a frying pan of grease, which hissed away on the fire with a noise similar to the cry of a troop of children in pursuit of a masker. In the meantime, Clopin appeared to hold a momentary conference with the Duke of Egypt and the Emperor of Galilee, who was completely drunk. Then he shouted, Silence! And as the cauldron and the frying pan did not heed him, and continued their duet, he jumped down from his hogshead, gave a kick to the boiler, which rolled 10 paces away, bearing the child with it, a kick to the frying pan, which upset in the fire with all its grease, and gravely remounted his throne, without troubling himself about the stifled tears of the children, or the grumbling of the old woman whose supper was wasting away in a fine white flame. Clopin made a sign, and the Duke, the Emperor, and the past masters of pickpockets and the isolated robbers came and ranged themselves around him in a horseshoe, of which Gringoire, still roughly held by the body, formed the center. It was a semicircle of rags, tatters, tinsel, pitchforks, axes, legs staggering with intoxication, huge, bare arms, faces sordid, dull, and stupid. In the midst of this round table of beggary, Clopin, as the doge of this senate, as the king of this peerage, as the pope of this conclave, dominated, first by virtue of the height of his hogshead, and next by virtue of an indescribable, haughty, fierce, and formidable air, which caused his eyes to flash, and corrected in his savage profile the bestial type of the race of vagabonds. One would have pronounced him a boar amid a herd of swine. Listen, said he to Gringoire, fondling his misshapen chin with his horny hand. I don't see why you should not be hung. It is true that it appears to be repugnant to you, but it is very natural, for you bourgeois are not accustomed to it. You form for yourselves a great idea of the thing. Here is a means of extricating yourself from your predicament for the moment. Will you become one of us? The reader can judge of the effect which this proposition produced upon Gringoire, who beheld life slipping away from him, and who was beginning to lose his hold upon it. He clutched at it again with energy. Certainly I will, and right heartily, said he. Do you consent, resumed Clopin, to enroll yourself among the people of the knife? Of the knife, precisely, responded Gringoire. You recognize yourself as a member of the free bourgeoisie, added the king of Tunis. There is a note here, and it says, right after bourgeoisie, a high-toned sharper. Okay. Of the free bourgeoisie, subject of the kingdom of Argot, a vagabond, in your soul, in my soul. I must call your attention to the fact, continued the king, that you will be hung all the same. The devil, said the poet. Only, continued Clopin, interpretatively, you will be hung later on, with more ceremony, at the expense of the good city of Paris, on a handsome stone gibbet and by honest men. That is a consolation. Just so, responded Gringoire. There are other advantages. In your quality of a high-toned sharper, you will not have to pay the taxes on mud, or the poor, or lanterns, to which the bourgeois of Paris are subject. So be it, said the poet. I agree. I am a vagabond, a thief, a sharper, a man of the knife, anything you please, and I am all that already, monsieur, king of Tunis, for I am a philosopher, et omnia in philosophia, omnis in philosophio, contentur. All things are contained in philosophy, all men in the philosopher, as you know. The king of Tunis scolded. What do you take me for, my friend? What patter are you jabbering at us? I don't understand. I'm above that. I kill. Cutthroat, yes. Cut purse, no. Gringoire tried to slip in some excuse between these curt words, which wrath rendered more and more jerky. I ask your pardon, monseigneur. It is not Hebrew, 'tis Latin. I tell you, resumed Clopin angrily, that I am not Jewish, and that I'll have you hung, belly of the synagogue, whom I entertain strong hopes of seeing nailed to a counter of one of these days, like the counterfeit coin that he is. So saying, he pointed his finger at the little bearded man who had accosted Gringoire with his factitote caritatum, and who, understanding no other language, beheld with surprise the king of Tunis's ill humour overflow upon him. At length, Monsieur Clopin calmed down. So, will you be a vagabond, you knave? He said to our poet. Of course, replied the poet. Willing is not all, said the surly Clopin. Good will doesn't put one onion the more into the soup, and 'tis good for nothing except to go to paradise with. Now, paradise and the thieves' bands are two different things. In order to be received among the thieves, you must prove that you are good for something, and for that purpose you must search the mannequin. I'll search anything you like, said Gringoire. Clopin made a sign. Several thieves detached themselves from the circle and returned a moment later. They brought two thick posts, terminated at their lower extremities in spreading timber supports, which made them stand readily upon the ground. To the upper extremity of the two posts they fitted a crossbeam, and the whole constituted a very pretty portable gibbet, which Gringoire had the satisfaction of beholding rise between him in a twinkling. Nothing was lacking, not even the rope, which swung gracefully over the crossbeam. What are they going to do? Gringoire asked himself with some uneasiness. A sound of bells, which he heard at that moment, put an end to his anxiety. It was a stuffed mannequin, which the vagabonds were suspending by the neck from the rope, a sort of scarecrow dressed in red, and so hung with mule bells and larger bells that one might have tricked out 30 Castilian mules with them. These 1,000 tiny bells quivered for some time with the vibration of the rope, then gradually died away and finally became silent when the mannequin had been brought into a state of immobility by that law of the pendulum which has dethroned the water clock and the hourglass. Then Clopin, pointing out to Gringoire a rickety old stool placed beneath the mannequin, "Climb up there." "Death of the devil," objected Gringoire. "I shall break my neck. Your stool limps like one of the marshal's. It has 1 hexameter leg and 1 pentameter leg. Climb, repeated Clopin. Gringoire mounted the stool and succeeded, not without some oscillations of head and arms, in regaining his center of gravity. Now, went on the king, twist your right foot under your left leg, and rise on the tip of your left foot. Monseigneur, said Gringoire, so you absolutely insist on my breaking one of my limbs? Clopin tossed his head. Hark ye, my friend, you talk too much. Here's the gist of the matter in 2 words. You are to rise on tiptoe, as I tell you. In that way you will be able to reach the pocket of the mannequin. You will rummage it. You will pull out the purse that is there. And if you do all this without hearing the sound of a bell, all is well. You shall be a vagabond. All we shall have to do will be to thrash you soundly for the space of a week. Ventre Dieu, I will be careful, said Gringoire. And suppose I do make the bell sound? Then you will be hanged. Do you understand? I don't understand at all, replied Gringoire. Listen, once more. You are to search the mannequin and take away its purse. If a single bell stirs during the operation, you will be hung. Do you understand that? Good, said Gringoire. I understand that. And then? If you succeed in removing the purse without our hearing the bells, you are a vagabond, and you will be thrashed for 8 consecutive days. You understand now, no doubt. No, Monseigneur, I no longer understand. Where is the advantage to me? Hanged in one case, cudgeled in the other. And a vagabond, resumed Clopin, and a vagabond, is that nothing? Is it for your interest that we should beat you in order to harden you to blows? Many thanks, replied the poet. Come, make haste, said the king, stamping upon his casque, which resounded like a huge drum. Search the mannequin, and let there be an end to this. I warn you, for the last time, that if I hear a single bell, you will take the place of the mannequin. The band of thieves applauded Clopin's words, and arranged themselves in a circle around the gibbet, with a laugh so pitiless that Gringoire perceived that he amused them too much not to have everything to fear from them. No hope was left for him, accordingly, unless it were the slight chance of succeeding in the formidable operation which was imposed upon him. He decided to risk it. But it was not without first having addressed a fervent prayer to the mannequin he was about to plunder, and who would have been easier to move to pity than the vagabonds. These myriad bells, with their little copper tongues, seemed to him like the mouths of so many asps, open and ready to sing, to sting, and to hiss. Oh, he said in a very low voice, is it possible that my life depends on the slightest vibrations of the least of these bells? He added with clasped hands, bells do not ring, handbells do not clang, mules' bells do not quiver. He made one more attempt upon Clopin. And if there should come a gust of wind? You will be hanged, replied the other without hesitation. Perceiving that no respite, no reprieve, no subterfuge was possible, he bravely decided upon his course of action. He wound his right foot round his left leg, raised himself on his left foot, and stretched out his arm. But at the moment when his hand touched the mannequin, his body, which was now supported upon one leg only, wavered on the stool which had been 3. He made an involuntary effort to support himself by the mannequin, lost his balance, and fell heavily to the ground, deafened by the fatal vibration of the 1,000 bells of the mannequin, which, yielding to the impulse imparted by his hand, described first a rotary motion, and then swayed majestically between the 2 posts. Malediction! He cried as he fell, and remained as though dead with his face to the earth. Meanwhile, he heard the dreadful peal above his head, the diabolical laughter of the vagabonds, and the voice of Clopin saying, "Pick me up that knave, and hang him without ceremony." He rose. They had already detached the mannequin to make room for him. The thieves made him mount the stool. Clopin came to him, passed the rope about his neck, and tapping him on the shoulder, "Adieu, my friend. You can't escape now, even if you digested with the Pope's guts. The word mercy died away upon Gringoire's lips. He cast his eyes about him, but there was no hope. All were laughing. Climb upon the crossbeam. Nimbly mounted the transverse beam, and in another minute Gringoire, on raising his eyes, beheld him with terror, seated upon the beam above his head. Now, resumed Clopin, as soon as I clap my hands, you, Andre the Red, will fling the stool to the ground with a blow of your knee. You, Francois, will cling to the feet of the rascal, and you, Bellevine, will fling yourself on his shoulders, and all three at once. Do you hear? Gringoire shuddered. Are you ready? Said Clopin to the three thieves, who held themselves in readiness to fall upon Gringoire. A moment of horrible suspense ensued for the poor victim, during which Clopin tranquilly thrust into the fire with the tip of his foot some bits of vine shoots which the flame had not caught. Are you ready? He repeated, and opened his hands to clap. 1 second more, and all would have been over. But he paused, as though struck by a sudden thought. One moment, said he, I forgot. It is not our custom to hang a man without inquiring whether there is any woman who wants him. Comrade, this is your last resource. You must wed either a female vagabond or the noose. The law of the vagabonds, singular as it may strike the reader, remains today written out at length in ancient English legislation. Gringoire breathed again. This was the second time that he had returned to life within an hour, so he did not dare trust to it too implicitly. Hola! Cried Clopin, mounted once more upon his cask. Hola, women, females! Is there among you, from the sorceress to her cat, a wench who wants this rascal? Hola, Colette! Elizabeth, Simone, Marie, Thone, Bernarde, Michel, Claude, Isabeau? Come and see, a man for nothing. Who wants him? Gringoire, no doubt, was not very appetizing in this miserable condition. The female vagabonds did not seem to be much affected by the proposition. The unhappy wretch heard them answer, No, hang him. There'll be the more fun for us all. Nevertheless, three emerged from the throng and came to smell of him. The first was a big wench with a square face. She examined the philosopher's deplorable doublet attentively. His garment was worn, and more full of holes than a stove for roasting chestnuts. The girl made a wry face. Old rag, she muttered, and addressing Gringoire, Let's see your cloak. I have lost it, replied Gringoire. Your hat? They took it away from me. Your shoes? They have hardly any soles left. Your purse? Alas, stammered Gringoire, I have not even a sou. Let them hang you then, and say thank you, retorted the vagabond wench, turning her back on him. The second, old, wrinkled, hideous, with an ugliness conspicuous even in the court of miracles, trotted round Gringoire. He almost trembled lest she should want him, but she mumbled between her teeth, He's too thin, and went off. The third was a young girl, quite fresh, and not too ugly. Save me, said the poor fellow to her, in a low tone. She gazed at him for a moment, with an air of pity, then dropped her eyes, made a plait in her petticoat, and remained in indecision. He followed all these movements with his eyes. It was the last gleam of hope. No, said the young girl at length. No, Yame would beat me. She retreated into the crowd. You are unlucky, comrade, said Clopin. Then rising to his feet upon his hogshead, No one wants him, he exclaimed, imitating the accent of an auctioneer to the great delight of all. No one wants him, once, twice, 3 times, and turning towards the gibbet, with the sign of his hand, Gone! Bellevue, Andre, Francois stepped up to Gringoire. At that moment a cry arose among the thieves, La Esmeralda! La Esmeralda! Gringoire shuddered, and turned toward the side whence the clamor proceeded. The crowd opened and gave passage to a pure and dazzling form. It was the young performer. La Esmeralda, said Gringoire, stupefied in the midst of his emotions by the abrupt manner in which that magic word knotted together all his reminiscence of the day. This rare creature seemed, even in the court of miracles, to exercise her sway of charm and beauty. The vagabonds, male and female, ranged themselves gently along her path, and their brutal faces beamed beneath her glance. She approached the victim with her light step. Her pretty goat followed her. Gringoire was more dead than alive. She examined him for a moment in silence. "Are you going to hang this man?" she asked gravely to Clopin. "Yes, sister," replied the king, "unless you take him for your husband." She made her pretty little pout with her under lip. "I'll take him," said she. Gringoire firmly believed that he had been in a dream ever since morning, and that this was the continuation of it. The change was, in fact, violent, though a gratifying one. They undid the noose and made the poet step down from the stool. His emotion was so lively that he was obliged to sit down. The Duke of Egypt brought an earthenware crock without uttering a word. The young girl offered it to Gringoire. "Fling it on the ground," said she. The crock broke into 4 pieces. "Brother," said the Duke of Egypt, laying his hands upon his foreheads, "she is your wife, sister. He is your husband for 4 years. Go." End of chapter 6. Oh boy, what a chapter. Yeah, exactly. Get married or be hanged. Just... Okay, so we have Gringoire, who has just escaped all these kids who, like, lit the pallet on fire, and he is just like wandering the streets, doesn't know where he is, and he ends up in a part of town that is the Court of Miracles. And as he's walking through, he comes across 3 beggars who look like they are in various stages of disability. And they're asking for money, and he doesn't have any money. He's already stated this to us, the reader, several times. He doesn't have any money, and so he keeps walking, and they get more aggressive, and they corner him, and he's like, I can't give you money. Like, I don't have any money. And they're like, oh, well, you need to go to the king. And so they bring him to the king, and the king is, we've met him earlier. The king of Thunis of Egypt, and I forgot the third one, but they were all part of the procession of the Feast of Fools. And he's there, and he's like, okay, here's the thing. We're gonna kill you. We're gonna kill you because you're bourgeois. And these are the same rules that we have to abide by when we're in the bourgeois territory. So you, being highfalutin, need to abide by our rules. And so, like, this is what would happen to us, so this is what's going to happen to you. And while this whole thing is happening, there's so many people around that are begging, and they are getting ready for the next day. So they're rewrapping fake wounds. They are learning how to foam at the mouth by, like, eating soap, like all of these things in order to get some money the next day. And so, like, all of this is happening while he's being put on trial. And Gringoire is just, like, in such a daze. He does not understand. And he's like, all right, can I leave? The king is like, you need to defend yourself. Like, this is what it is. We're gonna hang you. And he's like, I don't think you need to do that. Like, I'm a poet. I'm one of you guys. And the king's like, you're not. He's like, okay, I'm gonna give you this test. If you can take if you can go into this pocket of this mannequin that is just riddled with bells, uh, while standing on the stool with one leg wrapped around the other on your tiptoes, leaning over, if you can grab the purse from this mannequin without making any sound, you're one of us. Then we won't hang you, but we will beat you up for 8 days. Easy. And Gringoire is like, okay. And so he is seeing that he doesn't have any choice. And so he does this, but he falls and he fails. And so they're like, well, all right. So they get him ready. They put the rope around his neck and they have three other guys who are like going to assist in this hanging. And then the king Clopin is about to be like, all right, here we go. This is it. And he's like, wait a minute. There's another law that I almost forgot. Um, you might be married. If any of the women here want to marry you, then then you won't hang. That's all it is. Easy peasy. And so he's like, ladies, 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 everybody come take a look. Do you want? And they're all like, no. Absolutely not. No, no, no. And so Clopin is like, all right, well, sorry. And so he gives the like go ahead for these thieves to like assist in the hanging. But then Esmeralda comes. And everyone's like, La Esmeralda, La Esmeralda. And she walks in and she's like, are you gonna hang this guy? And the king's like, yeah, unless you want to marry him. And she's like, all right, I'll marry him. And so now they're married. And he takes this like this pot and he throws it to the ground. It breaks in four pieces. So now they're married for 4 years. And now he's a vagabond and he gets to live. What a day this poet has had. What an absolute day. So that was it's brutal. It's brutal. As we expected anything from Victor Hugo to be, it is brutal. The underbelly. Or at least what some see the underbelly to be. But that's gonna be it for today. We did it. We did it. We did it. We are about to start chapter 7. So good. So good. So good. So, thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure. As always. As always, as always. We'll continue right where we left off next time. Um, yeah. Whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye, friends.